The sound of the slap echoed louder than the heart monitor. It was a sharp, wet crack that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of Trauma Bay 4. For a heartbeat, the relentless machinery of Seattle Grace Memorial stuttered. The constant, piercing wail of the ambulance sirens outside felt distant, muffled by the sudden, suffocating weight of what had just happened. Dr. Silas Preston, the hospital's golden boy, didn't just berate the new nurse this time. He had let his ego, that bloated, expensive thing that barely fit through the double doors, finally spill over into violence. He didn't just yell, he put his hands on her. With a snarl of pure, unchecked entitlement, he wove his fingers deep into her hair and yanked her head back with a force that made her neck tendons strain. "Know your place, trash," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of expensive espresso and cold arrogance. The entire ER froze. Doctors stood mid-suture, their needles suspended in the air. Nurses dropped charts, the paper fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. The air in the room was thick with the copper tang of blood and the chemical bite of antiseptic. Under the flickering hum of the fluorescent lights, everyone waited for the collapse. They expected the quiet, timid nurse to break. They expected the woman who had spent 3 months scrubbing floors and restocking saline drips in total silence to dissolve into tears. But Major Harper Bennett did not cry. She stood there, anchored in her oversized blue scrubs, her frame seemingly too small for the gravity she suddenly exerted. Preston's hand was still tangled in her hair, pulling her scalp tight, but she didn't flinch. She didn't struggle. She didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, she slowly lowered her head and then looked up, meeting his eyes with a gaze that looked a century old. It was the look of someone who had seen the sun rise over the burning wreckage of a Blackhawk and didn't find the sight nearly as terrifying as the man standing in front of her. It was the look of a ghost who had survived things that would make a man like Preston catatonic. In that moment, the quiet nurse was gone. Beneath the fabric of her long sleeves, the shrapnel scarring on her forearm remained hidden, but the steel in her soul was laid bare. Her hands, which the staff thought were shaky from fear, were perfectly, terrifyingly steady. They were the same hands that had packed chest wounds under heavy fire in the Carino Valley while the world exploded around her. Preston felt powerful. He felt like a god disciplining a child. He was a man of old money and high titles, used to people bowing before his pedigree. He didn't realize he was currently reaching into a cage he wasn't brave enough to enter. He didn't know that the woman he was yanking by the hair was Major Harper Bennett, a decorated veteran of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The silence in the ER stretched, becoming a living thing. The tension was a wire pulled until it hummed. No one moved. No one breathed. They were all waiting to see what the ghost would do next. The world did not end with Dr. Preston's slap, though for those standing in the trauma bay, it felt as if the rotation of the earth had suddenly ground to a halt. After the shock subsided, the hospital simply regressed back into the low-frequency drone that defines the existence of Seattle Grace Memorial. This facility is a battlefield, though the weapons here are silent and the casualties are tallied in insurance codes and heart rates rather than territory gained. Instead of the sharp, concussive crack of mortar shells and the jagged roar of IEDs, the air here is filled with the relentless, piercing wail of ambulance sirens and the mechanical heartbeat of the ER monitors. This is the gray world, a place of high-voltage exhaustion where the fluorescent lights hum with a jagged, dying buzz that gnaws at the sanity of everyone trapped beneath their flickering glare. In this landscape of white tile and industrial bleach, Harper Bennett exists only as a shadow. She is 32 years old, but her eyes carry the weight of a century, a gaze that looks through people rather than at them, reflecting a soul that has seen the absolute limits of human endurance. She has been working at Seattle Grace for 3 months, and in that time she has spoken fewer than 50 words to her colleagues. She is a ghost, navigating a maze of suffering, moving through the chaos of the emergency room with a silence that unnerves those around her. To the rest of the staff, she is a non-entity, a travel nurse from nowhere with a shaky resume and a demeanor that suggests she is afraid of her own shadow. They see a woman who flinches at loud noises and keeps her head down, quiet nurse who is easy to ignore and even easier to bully. Harper deliberately seeks out the grunt work that the senior nurses avoid with practiced skill. She is the one who cleans the bedpans, the one who methodically restocks the saline drips, and the one who sits in the shadows of the supply closet just to breathe in the cool, metallic air. She takes the night shifts that no one else wants, the graveyard hours when the hospital is at its most hallowed and its most haunted. She moves through the corridors like a phantom, her presence so minimal that people often forget she is even in the room. To the staff, Harper has zero backbone. They watch her take the insults and the demands of the surgeons without a single word of protest. They whisper about her in the break room, wondering where she came from and why she seems so hollow inside. Chloe, a young nurse in bright pink scrubs, views her with a mixture of pity and relief. Relief that it is Harper in the firing line of the surgeons, tempers and not her. David, the head charge nurse, watches her retreat into the shadows and sighs, convinced that she is a woman who has finally been broken by the weight of life. They see her oversized scrubs and her slow, careful movements, and they assume the mind inside has decelerated to match a weary, defeated body. Then, there is the undisputed king of this gray castle, Dr. Silas Preston. Preston is the chief of trauma surgery, a man whose ego is as inflated as his Connecticut bank account. At 45, he is handsome in a way that he is painfully aware of, wearing his white surgical coat like a royal robe and his stethoscope like a piece of high-priced jewelry. He comes from old money, and he treats the hospital staff like personal servants who should be perpetually grateful for the privilege of standing in his light. To Silas, the world is divided into two groups, those who can advance his glittering career and those who are trash. He targets Harper because she appears to be easy prey. He barks her name across the trauma bay, demanding sterilized instruments 30 seconds before he actually needs them, just to watch her scramble. He mocks her incompetence in front of the residents, snatching tools from her tray and wiping his gloves on his gown after touching her, as if her very presence were contagious. He treats her like a ghost, a worthless piece of trash, whose only purpose is to absorb his daily frustrations. When he yells, "Bennett, move it," the sound echoes through the hallway like a command to a stray dog. Harper doesn't flinch. She doesn't defend her dignity or raise her voice in anger. She simply picks up the tray and walks into the fray, her voice low, flat, and entirely devoid of emotion. This silence is her armor, but Preston mistakes it for total submission. He thinks he has tamed her, unaware that her hands remain perfectly, terrifyingly steady, the same hands that packed chest wounds under heavy fire in the Corinal Valley. Beneath the long sleeves she wears even in the stifling heat of the ER, she hides the map of her true life. She hides the shrapnel scarring on her left forearm and the winged dagger tattoo on her right wrist, the insignia of the Night Stalkers, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. She isn't here for the prestige, the title, or the paycheck. She is here to reintegrate, to learn how to be a civilian again after a classified extraction mission in Syria went horribly wrong. The military psychologists told her she needed a low-stress environment to heal the noise in her head, the echoes of mortars and the screams of the fallen. So she scrubs the floors and lets a pompous surgeon treat her like a servant. She ignores the sneers and the trash comments because it is part of the mission. Blend in, don't engage, save lives. She is a decorated major who has performed surgery in the back of burning Blackhawks, now being told she isn't worth the air she breathes by a man who has never known a single day of real, visceral fear. The gray world is a place where titles define value, and because Harper has no title here, the system has deemed her worthless. But the steel remains in her gaze, hidden behind a mask of timid compliance. She takes her breaths in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and she waits. She knows that men like Preston are soft, that they break the moment the air conditioning goes out or their stock portfolio takes a hit. She has survived things that would make Silas Preston catatonic, and she knows that soon, the chaos of the ER will demand more than a pedigree and a handsome face. The humming of the ventilators and the flickering of the fluorescent lights continue, a rhythmic, mechanical countdown to the moment the mask will have to drop. Harper Bennett is back on duty, moving through the shadows of a hospital that doesn't realize it is currently housing a titan. She is the ghost, and she is simply waiting for the world to turn loud enough to require her true voice. To understand the woman standing in the trauma bay, you have to look past the blue scrubs and the quiet face. You have to go back to the places the world tries to forget. Major Harper Bennett was once a legend in a world made of sand and fire. She was a member of the 106th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. These are the pilots and medics who fly when the moon is gone, moving through the dark like spirits. Harper was their ghost. She did not work in a clean hospital with bright lights. She worked in the belly of a helicopter while it twisted and turned to avoid missiles. She saved lives while the air around her smelled of jet fuel and gunpowder. She remembers the Carino Valley. She remembers the day an RPG hit her convoy, turning the world into a mess of broken metal and heat. Her hands did not shake then. They stayed steady as she reached into the red mess to find a heartbeat. She remembers Captain Miller, her commanding officer. He had a hole in his chest that looked like a cavern. The enemy was shooting from a ridge only 300 meters away, and the dirt was kicking up around her feet. Harper did not move. She did not hide. She packed that wound and kept his blood inside his body because that was the mission. The military gave her medals, but they also gave her a discharge. They called it a medical exit after a mission in Syria went wrong. It was a secret mission, an extraction that ended in a nightmare. The doctor said her body was healed, but her mind was tired. They told her she needed a low-stress job. They told her she needed to learn how to be a person who doesn't carry a gun. So, she became a travel nurse. She took a job at Seattle Grace Memorial because it was big and cold and easy to get lost in. She thought she could hide there. Every day at the hospital, Harper plays a part. She plays the part of the timid nurse who is afraid of her own shadow. She lets Dr. Silas Preston call her trash. She lets him treat her like a servant because he is a soft man. She knows that men like Preston have never seen the things she has seen. They think they are strong because they have money and a big office. Harper knows that true strength is staying quiet when you want to scream. It is keeping your hands steady when everyone else is falling apart. She hides her history under long sleeves. She wears them even when the ER is hot enough to make everyone else sweat. Under the fabric of her left arm, there is a map of shrapnel scars. They are deep, jagged marks from a blast that should have killed her. On her right wrist, there is the tattoo. It is a dagger with wings, the mark of the people who go where others fear to walk. She does not show it to anyone. If the other nurses saw it, they would ask questions she doesn't want to answer. They would see that she isn't a ghost, she is a survivor. Harper has a routine to stay calm. When the noise of the hospital gets too loud, she goes to the supply closet. She leans her head against the cold metal shelf and breathes. She uses a pattern she learned in training. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. This is how she keeps the steel in her eyes. This is how she stops herself from reacting when Preston is cruel. She tells herself that he doesn't matter. He is just a small part of a much larger mission. She is here to reintegrate. She is here to find peace. But peace is hard to find in a place like Seattle Grace. The hospital is a different kind of war zone. Instead of bombs, there are heart attacks. Instead of bullets, there are car crashes. Harper watches it all with a silence that makes people nervous. She is 32, but she feels like she is 100 years old. She has seen the beginning and the end of life too many times to count. She does the work that no one else wants to do. She cleans the floors and fixes the saline drips because it gives her something to do with her hands. Dr. Silas Preston thinks he is the hero of every story. He walks through the double doors like he owns the air everyone is breathing. He comes from a family with a lot of money and power. He thinks that makes him a god. He looks at Harper and sees a nobody. He sees a woman with a shaky resume who won't fight back. He doesn't know that she is a major. He doesn't know that she has been cleared for duty by people who are much more important than him. He is a soft man living in a hard world, and he doesn't even know it. Harper stays in the shadows because it is safer there. She doesn't want the glory. She doesn't want the people in the pink scrubs to know she was a warrior. She just wants to do her job and go home. She wants to forget the smell of burning jet fuel. She wants to forget the sound of the wind through a broken cockpit. But the military didn't just teach her how to heal. They taught her how to scan a room. They taught her how to see the danger before it arrives. And right now, the danger is wearing a white coat and a stethoscope. Preston's insults are like raindrops on a windshield to her. He says she has no backbone. He says she is easy prey. Harper lets him believe it. She knows that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. She has seen men cry when the power goes out. She has seen leaders freeze when the shooting starts. She knows that when the real trouble comes, Preston will be the first one to look for help, and she will be the one who has to provide it. For 3 months, she has been a ghost. She has spoken fewer than 50 words because words are dangerous. They invite people in, and Harper isn't ready for guests. She is a decorated veteran who is pretending to be a civilian, and it is the hardest mission of her life. She takes the insults, she takes the slaps, and she takes the hair-pulling. She waits for the day she can finally leave the gray world behind. But until then, she will be steady, she will be silent, she will be Angel 6. The supply closet is her sanctuary. In the dark, she can be herself for a moment. She can remember the feeling of the 160th SOAR patch on her shoulder. She can remember the salute of a soldier she saved. Then she hears the roar of Preston's voice in the hallway. The mission continues. The mask goes back on. She pushes off the metal shelf and walks back into the chaos. The steel is back in her eyes. She is ready for the fray. The sliding doors of the emergency room burst open with a sound like a clap of thunder. The quiet of the gray world was instantly destroyed by the arrival of a storm. The paramedics rushed inside, their boots squeaking on the white tile floors as they pushed 2 gurneys through the entryway. The air in the room changed in a second, filled with the sharp, metallic smell of fresh blood and the damp scent of rain. Everyone in the ER stopped what they were doing to look at the chaos. Dr. Silas Preston took center stage, puffing out his chest to show he was in charge of the trauma bay. He shouted for the paramedics to talk to him, his voice booming over the noise of the machines. The lead paramedic yelled back that they had a male patient, roughly 50 years old, with multiple gunshot wounds to his chest and stomach. The man's blood pressure was crashing, and they had lost his pulse twice during the ambulance ride. Preston pointed to Bay 1 and ordered the team to move the patient there immediately. He started barking orders at the other nurses, telling David to get an IV line ready and Chloe to call the blood bank. Then he spun around and looked at Harper with eyes that were wild from the adrenaline he loved so much. He told her she was on suction duty and warned her not to mess it up. Harper moved into her position at the head of the bed without saying a single word. She looked down at the patient, and for a moment, her heart skipped a beat. The man was built like a heavy tank, with a gray beard and a large frame. The paramedics had cut open his tactical vest to reach his wounds. Underneath the gore and the dirt, Harper saw a tattoo on his shoulder that changed everything. It was a dagger with wings, the mark of the Special Forces. She looked closely at his swollen face and recognized the bone structure immediately. It was Master Sergeant Knox, also known as Fort Knox. He had been her training officer at Fort Bragg almost 10 years ago. While the room exploded into controlled chaos, Harper grabbed the suction catheter and cleared the man's airway with practiced efficiency. Preston was screaming for the paddles to shock the man's heart back to life. The machines were beeping loudly, signaling that the patient was dying. But as Harper worked, she noticed something that Dr. Preston missed entirely. The blood on the man's chest wasn't just pooling, it was bubbling. Her mind, trained by years of battlefield surgery, registered the problem instantly. Tension, pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed, and the air was trapped inside, putting deadly pressure on his heart. Harper knew that shocking the heart would not work if the air pressure wasn't released first. She watched as Preston slammed the paddles onto the man's chest and yelled, "Clear!" The body convulsed from the electricity, but the monitor still showed a flat line. Preston screamed for the team to charge the machine to a higher setting. Harper knew she had to speak up, even if it meant breaking her quiet persona. She said the doctor's name, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. It wasn't the soft whisper she usually used. It was firm and steady. She told him the patient's breath sounds were absent on the right side and his trachea was deviated. She told him it was a tension pneumo and that he needed a needle decompression right now. The room went completely silent for a fraction of a second as the staff stared at the nurse, who never spoke. Preston looked at her, and his face turned red with a deep, boiling rage. He asked her if she was a doctor or if she got her degree from a cereal box. He mocked her for trying to give him medical advice. Harper didn't back down. She pointed to the patient's neck and told him to look at the jugular distension. She warned him that if he didn't decompress the chest, the man would die in 30 seconds. Preston roared at her to shut up, reminding her that he was the attending surgeon and she was just a nurse who changed bedpans. He ordered the team to shock the man again. The second shock did nothing, and the heart monitor continued to flatline. Preston threw the paddles onto the crash cart in frustration and told the team to call the time of death. He was ready to give up on a man who had survived a dozen wars. Harper looked at her old teacher, a man who had taught her how to survive, and she knew she couldn't let him die because of an ego. She didn't think about her job or the consequences. She just moved. She stepped away from the suction unit and grabbed a large needle from the open supply tray. Preston stepped in front of her, blocking her path to the patient. He asked her what she thought she was doing and screamed at her to get out of his trauma bay. Preston told her she was fired and ordered her to leave the room immediately. Harper ignored him, her eyes turning into cold, dark tunnels of focus. She told him the patient still had a rhythm that could be saved if the pressure was released. She stepped to the side to bypass the doctor, refusing to let Knox die. That was the moment Preston finally snapped. He was a man who had never been told no in his entire life, and he lost control. He reached out and grabbed the back of Harper's scrub cap, tangling his fingers deep into her hair. He yanked her head back with violent force, his face only inches from hers. He hissed at her to know her place and called her a worthless piece of trash. The violence of his motion sent Harper stumbling backward into the metal cabinets with a loud clang. The needle she was holding clattered to the floor. The entire ER stopped once again. Doctors and nurses froze in shock, unable to believe what they had just seen. Violence against staff was rare, but a surgeon assaulting a nurse during a code was unheard of. Preston stood there with his chest heaving, looking like a snarl was stuck on his face. He felt powerful, like a god who had just punished a disobedient child. He expected Harper to crumble and run out of the room crying. He expected to declare the patient dead and move on with his day. But Harper didn't cry. She slowly lowered her head and touched the back of her head where he had pulled her hair. She adjusted her scrub cap with a calm that was terrifying to watch. When she looked up, the timid, quiet nurse was gone. In her place was a soldier who was ready for combat. Her posture shifted, her shoulders squared, and she moved her feet into a shoulder-width stance. She told him in a low whisper that he shouldn't have done that. The weight of her voice made the hair on the back of the charge nurse's neck stand up. Preston barked for someone to get security and get this woman out of his hospital. Harper didn't wait for security. She looked at David and told him to give her a blade and a chest tube kit. David was terrified and told her to stop because Preston was the chief. Harper didn't listen. She moved with the explosive speed of a viper. Preston tried to grab her arm again to stop her. Harper didn't strike him, but she didn't let him touch her either. She stepped inside his reach, trapped his wrist, and applied pressure to a nerve while sweeping his leg. It happened so fast that no one could follow the movement. 1 second Preston was standing, and the next he was face down on the floor, with his arm twisted behind his back. He screamed in high-pitched agony as the trash he had mocked pinned him to the linoleum. Harper ordered him to stay down, her voice sounding like a command from a high-ranking officer to a hostile enemy. She released him, stepped over his groaning body, and walked straight to Master Sergeant Knox. She picked up a fresh needle and told David to time her. She found the correct spot on the man's chest and plunged the needle in. A loud hiss of escaping air filled the silent room. Instantly, The heart monitor began to beep again with a steady sinus rhythm. The man's heart was beating because a ghost had refused to stay in the shadows. Harper looked down at Preston, who was struggling to get up with a face purple from humiliation. She stripped off her gloves and told him the patient was alive and that he was relieved of duty. Preston scrambled up, his eyes bulging with rage, and screamed that he was the chief surgeon and would have her arrested. He threatened to destroy her and asked if she even knew who he was. Harper looked him dead in the eye and pulled up the sleeve of her shirt. She showed him the scarred muscle of her arm and the Special Forces tattoo on her wrist. She told him she knew exactly who he was. A liability. She turned to the stunned charge nurse and told him to call the police. She also told him to call a general at the Pentagon and tell him that Ghost had been compromised. David's jaw hung open as he tried to understand what was happening. Harper told him to just make the call and keep the idiot away from her patient. The sirens of the police department grew louder outside, signaled by the flashing blue lights reflecting in the wet windows. 2 officers and a frantic hospital administrator pushed their way into the ER. Preston was waiting for them, holding an ice pack to his wrist and pretending to be a victim. He pointed a trembling finger at Harper and told the officers she was unstable and had assaulted him. Harper stood by the patient's bed at parade rest, her hands clasped behind her back, waiting for the law to arrive. She didn't try to run or hide. She watched the monitor of Master Sergeant Knox, making sure her teacher stayed stable while the world around her fell apart again. The older police officer approached Harper with his hand near his holster and told her to step away from the patient. Harper turned slowly and gave him a medical update on the man's condition, telling him the patient needed to go to the ICU. The officer snapped that he didn't ask for her opinion and told her to put her hands behind her back. Harper complied without resisting, and the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. David tried to speak up for her, saying she had saved the man's life, but Preston threatened to fire him and send him to a clinic in Alaska. David froze in fear, unable to find his courage. Harper gave him a small nod, telling him to stand down because this wasn't his fight to win. As the officers marched Harper toward the exit, the hospital staff watched in a heavy silence. Patients on gurneys and other doctors avoided looking at her, but the nurses, the ones who did the hard work every day, watched her with a new kind of respect. They had seen the takedown, and they knew the truth. Just before she reached the doors, the chairman of the hospital board, Sterling Preston, burst into the room. He was a powerful man, known for ruining careers. He walked straight to Harper and hissed that she had made a grave mistake. He promised to sue her and make sure she never worked in healthcare again. Harper didn't blink or cower. She just analyzed him like a threat and waited for the next move in a war that was far from over. The air in Trauma Bay. One was heavy with the scent of copper blood and the ozone of the idling crash cart. Dr. Silas Preston stood between Harper Bennett and the dying man on the gurney, his posture a wall of arrogance and unearned authority. To Preston, the flat line on the monitor was a finality, a convenient end to a messy situation that challenged his control. But to Harper, that silence was a call to action she had answered 100 times in darker places than this. She knew that Master Sergeant Knox was still in there, his heart struggling against a cage of trapped air that Preston refused to see. Harper did not ask for permission again. She reached for the tray of sterile instruments with a hand that was as steady as a surgeon's, despite the chaos swirling around her. When she picked up the 14-gauge needle, the room seemed to shrink until there was only her, the patient, and the man trying to stop her. Preston's face was twisted in a snarl of disbelief. He stepped closer, his chest puffed out, trying to use his physical size to intimidate a woman he had called trash just moments before. He told her she was fired, his voice a roar that echoed off the cold metal cabinets. He ordered her to get out of his trauma bay, but Harper didn't move toward the door. She told him that the patient had a rhythm, but the pressure was killing him. She explained that she wasn't going to let a brave man die because of a doctor's ego. That was the moment Silas Preston lost the last of his professional mask. He was a man who had been raised on the idea that his word was law, and the defiance of a quiet nurse was more than he could handle. He reached out and grabbed Harper by the back of her scrub cap, his fingers tangling painfully in her hair. He yanked her head back with a violence that shocked everyone watching from the nurse's station. "I said know your place," Preston hissed, his face so close that Harper could see the red veins of rage in his eyes. He called her a worthless piece of trash one last time, convinced that physical force would make her crumble. The force of the pull sent Harper stumbling back against the heavy metal cabinets with a sound that rang through the silent ER. The needle she had been holding clattered to the floor, useless now. Preston stood over her, breathing hard, feeling a sick sense of power as he waited for the tears to start. He expected her to run away sobbing, leaving him to declare the time of death and keep his reputation intact. But the woman who stood up from the floor was not the timid nurse from nowhere. Harper Bennett slowly lowered her head, centering her breath just as she had done in the back of burning Blackhawks. She reached up and adjusted her scrub cap with a calm that felt more dangerous than any shout. When she looked up at Preston, the fear he wanted was nowhere to be found. Her posture shifted instantly. Her shoulders squared and her feet spread into a combat stance she had mastered long before she ever set foot in Seattle Grace. "You shouldn't have done that," Harper said. Her voice was a low whisper, but it had the weight of an executioner's blade. The entire room felt the shift in gravity. Preston's bravado wavered, and he barked for security, but his voice lacked its usual bite. He wanted her gone, but Harper was finally home. She turned to David, the charge nurse, and told him to give her a new blade and a chest tube kit. David was frozen, caught between the rules of the hospital and the raw authority radiating from the woman in the oversized scrubs. Preston tried to grab her arm again, reaching out to reassert his dominance. He started to tell her what he had already ordered, but Harper didn't let him finish. She didn't strike him with a fist. She didn't need to. She moved with the explosive speed of a viper, stepping into his guard before he could react. She trapped his wrist with a grip like iron and applied pressure to the radial nerve while sweeping his leg in one continuous motion. It was a move perfected in the dirt of training camps and the heat of combat zones. It happened so fast that the staff watching couldn't even process the motion. 1 second, the chief of surgery was standing tall, and the next, he was face down on the linoleum floor. His arm was pinned behind his back at an angle that forced a high-pitched scream of agony from his lungs. Harper leaned down, her face a mask of cold discipline, and gave him a single command: "Stay down." It wasn't a request from a nurse. It was an order from an officer to a hostile threat. She released him and stepped over his groaning body as if he were nothing more than debris on a flight line. She picked up a fresh needle and looked at David. "David, time me," she said, her voice steady and clear. She located the second intercostal space on Knox's massive chest and plunged the needle in with a precision that Preston could only dream of. A sharp hiss of pressurized air escaped the chest cavity, a sound that cut through the silence of the room like a whistle. Almost immediately, the heart monitor on the wall began to beep. Beep, beep, beep. The flat line vanished, replaced by a steady sinus rhythm. The man's heart was beating again because the air was no longer strangling it. Harper watched the monitor for a moment, making sure the rhythm held before looking down at the man on the floor. Preston was scrambling to his knees, clutching his throbbing wrist, his face a deep shade of purple from the combined weight of humiliation and shock. He looked around the room, realizing that every nurse and intern had seen him pin like a common brawler. Harper stripped off her gloves with a snap that sounded like a gunshot. She told him that the patient was alive and then delivered the final blow. "And you, doctor, are relieved of duty." Preston's eyes bulged as he tried to regain his footing. He screamed that he was the chief surgeon, that she had assaulted him, and that he would have her arrested and destroyed. He asked her if she even knew who he was, falling back on the only weapon he had left, his name. Harper looked him dead in the eye, her gaze as cold as a mountain peak. She didn't argue with him. Instead, she reached for the hem of her long-sleeved undershirt. Slowly, she pulled the fabric up, revealing the scarred, corded muscle of her forearm. She showed him the distinctive tattoo on her wrist, the dagger with wings. She told him she knew exactly who he was, a liability. She turned her back on him, dismissing him entirely, and spoke to David. She told the charge nurse to call the police and to call General Holloway at the Pentagon. She told him to tell the general that Ghost had been compromised. David stood there with his jaw hanging open, looking from the quiet nurse to the disgraced surgeon on the floor. He asked who the general was, his voice shaking with confusion. Harper didn't waste time explaining. She told him to just make the call and, most importantly, to keep the idiot away from her patient. While the rest of the ER staff stood paralyzed, Harper turned back to the man on the bed. She began to stabilize Master Sergeant Knox, her hands moving with a fluid, practiced grace that had nothing to do with nursing school and everything to do with the 160th SOAR. She was no longer a shadow. She was the center of the room, a major back in her element, protecting her own while the world outside began to burn for the Prestons. The quiet nurse was dead, and in her place stood a soldier who had just declared war on the hospital's golden boy. Preston continued to shout threats, but they sounded hollow now, the desperate noise of a man who realized his empire was built on sand. Harper didn't listen. She watched the monitor, counting the heartbeats of the man she had saved, waiting for the cavalry she knew was already on the way. The mission had changed, but the goal was the same. Survive the night and ensure the truth survived with her exit. The arrival of the Seattle Police Department was not subtle. 2 uniformed officers, followed by a frantic hospital administrator, pushed through the double doors of the ER. The atmosphere in the trauma bay, which had been charged with the electric energy of Harper's intervention, suddenly turned cold and clinical again. Dr. Silas Preston was waiting for them, leaning against the nurse's station and holding an ice pack to his wrist. He had regained his composure, replacing his recent fear with a cold, calculated narrative. He looked every bit the victimized professional, his white coat a shield against the truth of his own incompetence. "That's her," Preston said, pointing a trembling finger at Harper. Harper was standing by Trauma Bay 1, her eyes fixed on the cardiac monitor of Master Sergeant Knox. The patient was stable now, his chest rising and falling rhythmically, thanks to the tube she had inserted. She hadn't tried to run, and she hadn't tried to hide the needle or the blade. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back at parade rest, waiting for the system to do what it always did. "Officer," Preston said, his voice dripping with practiced victimhood. "This woman is unstable. She disobeyed a direct medical order and endangered a patient's life. And when I tried to intervene, she physically assaulted me. She nearly broke my wrist. I want to press charges immediately." The older officer, Sergeant Brady, looked at Harper. In her oversized scrubs, she looked small and unimposing. Her face was impassive, a mask of stone that gave away nothing. Brady approached her, his hand resting near his holster, and ordered her to step away from the patient. Harper turned slowly, her voice flat and factual. She told him the patient was stable but needed transport to the ICU, explaining that the pneumothorax needed monitoring. Brady, influenced by the chief surgeon's presence, snapped that he didn't ask for a medical opinion. He told her to turn around and put her hands behind her back. Harper complied without a word of protest. She didn't resist as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The sound was sharp and final, cutting through the murmurs of the ER staff. David, the charge nurse, finally found a sliver of courage and stepped forward, his voice shaking. He told the officers they couldn't do this, that she had saved the man's life while Preston was going to let him die. But Preston's eyes narrowed into slits. He threatened David, telling him to shut his mouth unless he wanted to be looking for a job at a veterinary clinic in Alaska. David froze, his fear of the Preston name outweighing his sense of justice. He looked at Harper, his eyes pleading for forgiveness for his cowardice. Harper just gave him a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent order to stand down because this wasn't his fight to win. "Get her out of here," Preston sneered, "and make sure the press doesn't see her. I don't want this hospital associated with psychopaths." As the officers marched Harper through the crowded ER, the atmosphere was thick with a strange tension. Patients on gurneys watched in silence, and doctors avoided her gaze. But the nurses, the ones who changed the sheets and cleaned the vomit, watched her with a new, quiet respect. They had seen the takedown, and they knew who the real monster in the room was. Just as they reached the exit, the administrative doors burst open. Sterling Preston, the chairman of the hospital board and Silas's father, strode into the room. He was a silver-haired man, built like a shark, known for burying lawsuits and ruining careers. He ignored the police and went straight to his son, who immediately dropped the professional facade to whine about his arm. Sterling turned his gaze on Harper, his eyes like ice. He walked up to her, invading her personal space, and hissed that she had made a grave mistake. He promised to ensure she never worked in healthcare again, and to sue her for every penny she would ever make. "By the time I'm done with you, you'll be lucky to get a job sweeping streets," Sterling threatened. Harper looked at him, analyzing him as if he were a minor tactical obstacle. She noted his high blood pressure and narcissistic traits, concluding his threat level was low. Sergeant Brady pushed her forward, toward the waiting squad car. As she was shoved into the back seat, Harper allowed herself one glance back at the hospital. She saw Silas Preston smirking in the ambulance bay, his father's arm around his shoulder. They thought they had won. They thought this was about a simple lawsuit or a firing. But as Harper leaned her head against the wire mesh of the car window, she began to count. It had been 1 minute since her call to General Holloway. The extraction team would be spinning up. The war hadn't ended for Harper Bennett. It had simply moved to a new battlefield. At the precinct, Harper was placed in an interrogation room, a drab box of gray cinder blocks with a flickering fluorescent light. She sat on a metal chair, one hand cuffed to the table, and waited for 2 hours. Detective Reed, a tired man with coffee stains on his tie, finally entered and tossed her file onto the table. He called her a ghost, because her record for the last several years was a complete blank. Reed tried a good cop routine, telling her that the Prestons were pushing for felony assault charges and claiming she used a scalpel. Harper finally spoke, her voice flat. "I didn't use a scalpel on him. If I had used a blade, he wouldn't be standing." Reed was visibly unnerved by her factual delivery. He offered to knock the charges down to a misdemeanor if she gave him her side of the story, warning her that a public defender wouldn't stand a chance against the Preston legal team. Harper didn't ask for a lawyer. She asked for her one phone call. Reed pushed a landline phone across the table, and Harper dialed a long sequence of digits he didn't recognize. Her voice shifted into a command cadence Reed had never heard from a suspect. "This is Sierra 709 Ener. Code Black. Location Seattle PD Precinct 4. Hostage situation. I am the hostage." She hung up and told a stunned Detective Reed that he might want to get some coffee because it was going to be a long night. Before Reed could respond, the door banged open, and Charles Whitlock, the Preston family attorney, walked in. He offered Harper a deal: sign a confession admitting to a mental break and a surrender of her nursing license, and the charges would be dropped. He told her she was a bug on the windshield of a very expensive car. Harper picked up the pen, but instead of signing, she spun it in her fingers, a habit from her sniper days. She asked if he had checked her military discharge papers. Whitlock laughed, dismissing her service as peeling potatoes. Then, the heavy steel door of the precinct's holding area slammed open with enough force to shake the cinder block walls. The false defeat was over. The tide was about to turn. The silence in the interrogation room was suddenly shattered by a sound that didn't belong in a city police precinct. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding that vibrated through the cinder block walls and made the coffee in Detective Reed's cup ripple in perfect circles. Outside, the night sky over the 4th precinct was no longer dark. It was lit up by the blinding white searchlights of 2 Blackhawk helicopters hovering just feet above the parking lot. The wind from their rotors was so strong it sent trash cans and squad car covers flying into the streets. Inside, the heavy steel doors of the holding area were kicked open with a force that made Charles Whitlock jump out of his expensive chair. "What the hell is going on out there?" Reed shouted, his hand instinctively reaching for his service weapon. But he stopped the moment he saw the men entering the hallway. These weren't local cops. They were men in full tactical gear, carrying carbines and moving with a terrifying, silent efficiency. They moved into the room and scanned the corners instantly, their eyes behind night vision goggles as cold as stone. Then, the room went even quieter, as a man in a crisp army green service uniform stepped through the door. 3 silver stars glistened on his shoulder boards. Lieutenant General Holloway did not look at the detective, and he certainly did not look at the lawyer. He walked straight to Harper, who was still cuffed to the metal table. The general, a man who had commanded entire theaters of war, stopped and stood at perfect attention. "Major," Holloway said, his voice a low rumble of respect. "General," Harper replied, her voice as steady as it had been in the trauma bay. Holloway didn't waste words. He looked at Reed and ordered him to get the cuffs off her immediately. Charles Whitlock, trying to find his lost courage, stepped between them. He started to ramble about jurisdiction and his client, Dr. Preston, but Holloway turned a look on him that had silenced dictators. The general told the lawyer that Harper Bennett was a protected asset of the United States government. He explained that the man she had assaulted had nearly killed a highly decorated master sergeant who was currently under his protection. He poked a finger into Whitlock's chest and told him he was interfering with a federal investigation into medical malpractice. Reed fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the handcuffs. Harper stood up and rubbed her wrists, looking more like an officer than a nurse. Holloway told her they had a chopper waiting, and that Master Sergeant Knox was awake and asking for her. As they turned to leave, Harper stopped in front of a sweating, pale Whitlock. She leaned in close and told him to tell Preston that the bug just hit back. The return to Seattle Grace Memorial was like a military invasion. The rooftop had been turned into a command post guarded by military police. Inside the VIP suite, Harper found Knox alive and breathing, surrounded by a military medical team that knew exactly who she was. He saw her and called her Ghost, a weak grin spreading through his beard. He told her he thought she was the angel of death coming to collect him. Harper took his hand and told him, "Not today." But the victory wasn't complete yet. General Holloway stood by the window and told Harper that Sterling Preston wasn't backing down. The billionaire was calling in favors from senators and governors, trying to frame Harper as a rogue soldier with PTSD who had snapped. He was threatening to leak information about a classified mission in Syria, Operation Cinder, to ruin her and her team. He was holding her reputation hostage to save his son's ego. "So we fight," Harper said. But they couldn't just use force against a civilian billionaire. Holloway showed her a tablet filled with files his intelligence officers had dug up while she was in the cell. It turned out Silas Preston had a trail of bodies behind him. Wrongful deaths, amputated limbs, and overdoses, all settled out of court and scrubbed from the records with Sterling's money. It was a graveyard of medical errors. To win, they needed a witness from the inside who could prove the cover-ups were real. Harper knew exactly who to go to: Nurse Kinsley. She knew Kinsley managed the digital archives and had seen the black file. Harper told the general she was going back into the lion's den to get the hard drives before Preston could purge the servers. Holloway warned her he couldn't send troops into a civilian hospital for a theft. Harper just zipped up her flight suit and told him she was just a nurse going to pick up her last paycheck. She moved through the hospital basement like a shadow, avoiding cameras and guards Sterling had hired. She reached the server room just as a progress bar on a screen showed the files were 85% deleted. Kinsley was inside, sobbing and terrified. 2 of Sterling's hired mercenaries burst in, one with a gun and one with a stun baton. Harper didn't hesitate. She threw a wrench with perfect aim, striking the gunman and launching herself into a fight that ended with both men on the floor. Just as she reached for the hard drive, Silas Preston appeared in the doorway, waving a gun and screaming that she had ruined his life. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, 20 nurses stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the hallway with IV poles and oxygen tanks. They were done being afraid. While Silas wavered, Harper ripped the hard drive out of the rack. She walked past the sobbing doctor and joined the nurses who had held the line. The librarian was gone, replaced by a leader. She looked at the drive in her hand and told David it was time to watch the news. The cavalry hadn't just arrived to save her. They had arrived to help her finish the war. The grand atrium of Seattle Grace Memorial was transformed into a cathedral of corporate justice. Sterling Preston stood at the podium, still trying to spin a masterpiece of lies to the media, calling Harper a disturbed individual, suffering from a psychotic break. But the massive LED wall behind him flickered to life, not with donor names, but with the undeniable truth. The security footage played in a loop, showing the doctor's cowardice and the viciousness of his assault on Harper. Then came the black files, a waterfall of confidential documents detailing years of buried medical errors and hush-money settlements authorized by the Preston family. As the crowd gasped, the glass doors of the atrium stopped spinning. Lieutenant General Holloway entered, flanked by state troopers and military police. Sterling Preston was arrested on stage, charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice, while his son Silas was led away in handcuffs. Weeping and unable to meet the eyes of the staff he had once tormented, a thunderous ovation erupted from the hospital staff, the nurses, the janitors, and the doctors, who were finally free from the reign of fear. They cheered for the woman in the grease-stained jumpsuit who had stood in the fire and refused to burn. General Holloway offered Harper her commission back with full honors, but she looked at the team of nurses she had fought for and realized her war was over, but her work was not. She declined the offer, choosing to stay at the hospital to ensure that no surgeon ever developed a God complex again. The moral: the story of Harper Bennett reminds us that true strength isn't about rank, title, or wealth. It is about what you do when lives are on the line and the pressure is on. Silas Preston thought his status made him untouchable, but he learned that you never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book is a combat-hardened veteran. One person standing up for what is right can bring down an empire of corruption. Did you enjoy this story of hidden heroism? If so, please smash that like button to help our channel grow. Subscribe and hit the bell notification so you never miss a new tale of justice.